Hi, I'm Brandi Lytle, founder of Not So Mommy and creator of the olive green Childless Not by Choice Awareness Ribbon. This year, during National Infertility Awareness Week 2021, we are owning our voice. In this special Tutum Talks series, we will speak with experts who unpack topics that are important to people who are involuntarily childless. Today, we're talking with Lana Walker of Worthy and Content. Joby recently introduced me to Lana's work. As I looked through her website, her words resonated deeply with me. Lana is an emotional freedom technique, EFT practitioner, providing online therapy around the world to support women and men without children. I'm very excited to speak with her today. Welcome, Lana.
Thank you very much, Brandi. Thank you for having me, and I'm very excited to be here too. I'm childless not by choice. Always imagined I was going to be a mum. I had a teenage pregnancy, actually. So whether other people have been in the same boat, I had a teenage pregnancy and then a termination because at the age of 18, I wasn't ready to become a mum. So I just assumed that later on in life, when I got married, I would fall pregnant. And obviously that hasn't happened. I ended up having unexplained infertility. I ended up having 2 miscarriages and 5 IVF cycles. And I also realized that when I was with my ex-husband, who I went through the fertility treatment with, that I shouldn't be having a baby with him. So I ended up leaving my husband at the time and I remarried someone else. And I thought I was going to be one of those stories of, oh, she's with the wrong man, then she gets with the right man and everything's okay. And that didn't happen either. So even with IVF treatments and looking at all the things that were going on, thinking emotionally I was in the right place now, it still didn't happen. And I realized that I was never going to be a mum. So that's my story: IVF, miscarriages, unexplained infertility.
Well, today's Owning Our Voice theme is the olive green Childless Not by Choice Awareness Ribbon. And my hope is that fellow CNBC feel confident enough to proudly display the olive green ribbon. And on your website, Lana, you say that you would like us to help feel better about childlessness. And I believe Lana and I have similar goals, wanting to help the fellow childless to move forward as more than childless. But how do we do that? Well, Lana, after grieving for many, many years, you say that you are now worthy and content despite not being a mother. So how did you achieve this? How can we move forward defining ourselves as more than childless?
Well, it's a really big question, isn't it? And it's not something that happens quickly, but it does happen. And if I go back to how I felt when I was in my 30s, and I basically spent my 30s trying to conceive and my 40s grieving for that loss. And I'd look back when I was in my 30s and I'd see these women who are older than me, and I'm perimenopausal now, and I think, well, how have they managed to still have a life when they haven't been able to have children? And it was like, well, I'll never be able to do that. I am going to have a child. I'm determined to have a child. I'll leave no stone unturned to have a child. And I thought it just is not possible. There is no way you can go through life and still enjoy life without being a mum. And when I look back there, I think, was I quite smug's not the right word, but I did think, well, they mustn't have wanted a baby as much as I did, because I was going to do everything I could in my power to have a baby. So for me, realizing, and that takes a long time to realize and accept that you are not going to be a mum and have children. It is a journey, and as much as people can talk about the J word, it's a journey that takes you to places you never thought you'd go, places you don't necessarily want to go again, but you do get to move through. And so if you imagine where you're starting when you're either trying to conceive or you're moving through that trying to conceive journey, and eventually the options for conception or adoption or meeting the right man or whatever it is, those options start fading away. And then you're left with, is this it? Is this what my life is going to be like? There is a way to then move through and move on. Again, moving on as a word and as a concept is almost like, oh, well, okay, well, I have to move on from this. And it does take time. It is doable. It's not necessarily easy, and it'll be different for everybody. But grieving and grieving properly is really important for that. So it's not as though you just wake up one day and go, all right, I've finished my last round of treatment. I know I'm not going to have any more treatment. I'm not going to adopt. Whatever it is that is relevant for you, you don't just wake up and say, right, well, I'm going to move on now. It does take time, and that's the healing. And that's the healing with grief as well. We really need to grieve for our loss in order to have that healing effect that grief brings, so that we can then look at what are the possibilities. Now, for me, I used to almost, how people say, fake it till you make it. I don't actually like that. I much prefer authenticity rather than faking it. But I would adopt I'm concentrating on the positive aspects of not having children. And while I would say it, I wasn't really embracing it. And it was helpful to a degree, but it was when I really spent time looking at what is my life about, what do I actually want to get out of life now that I'm not going to be having children, and how do I want to feel about that? It was when I realized that I didn't want to carry the heaviness and the burden of being childless. I didn't want to carry that forward anymore. That's when things started to change for me, because I just assumed that I was going to stay sad forever. I thought you had to, because you no longer had the child. And I used to use a phrase that a friend of mine had given me, and was, how sometimes we struggle with when people say, have you got kids? And you go, no, I don't. I want to say something really rude, but I better be polite. And we've got all that struggle going on. She had a phrase that was, no, I don't have children. It's the biggest sadness of my life. And I thought, oh, that's great. So I used that for a few years. Then after a while, I'd use it and I'd say, oh, I didn't realize I was sad still, or I wasn't expecting the reactions I had when I used the word sadness. I was like, oh, yes, that's right. I have to be sad because I haven't got children. And it was coming to that realization that, is there something that I can leave behind? Can I leave those emotions behind and move on, move through, move forward, move sideways even? That the possibilities of actually I can feel better about childlessness, that's when the possibilities started revealing themselves. And it's almost like you've got to be ready for that conversation. It's like anything. You can't push it. You can't force it. There's no timeline on grief and how we feel, but it is possible. For me, as an EFT practitioner, it's all about the energy and the emotions. And it was actually, I had a massage in Italy several years ago, and that's what got me into this journey of becoming a therapist. I had this amazing massage, and I said afterwards, I feel empty, I feel cleansed, and I felt empty, not in a barren way, but in a real spring clean. I've got rid of the heaviness and the burden. And I said to the therapist, why was that massage so different? And he said, Lana, I was working with your energy. You were ready to let go. You just didn't know how. And I was like, oh my goodness. So when I came off holidays, I researched more about energy therapy. And I use energy therapy in terms of EFT, which is emotional freedom techniques. You may have heard it described as tapping. We really work at what you're feeling, what is the energy in your body. And so for a lot of childless women and men, it can be, that churning in the stomach, the tears in the eyes, just listening to other people's stories, seeing lots of things in social media, and working on that energy. And while we have those reactions, it can be very damaging, and you think, oh, I have to stay like this. But actually, we are allowed to let go of those feelings and those emotions. And there's a whole process underneath that. But to be able to say, I no longer want to feel this way. I no longer want to feel this heaviness and this burden and the loneliness and the exclusion and the envy and all those other things that we feel when we don't have children. To know that those feelings don't have to be permanent is a fantastic way. And for me, that's what worked for me. It doesn't, everybody else is different. But to know that actually I don't need to stay sad permanently. It's a really good way to move on. And again, language and the phrases that we use, really think about the language that you use for yourself and that you're listening to from others, to see about How moving on isn't necessarily easy. It's not necessarily quick, but it is possible. So much that goes into it, and there's so many things that are connected. I hope that that explains a little bit about how I felt comfortable about moving on, and I use that term loosely.
A couple of things that really caught my attention were, I liked how you said that to move through. And then you mentioned grieving properly, and then talking about the EFT and the energy. So could you give just one or two examples of what you mean by grieving properly, and perhaps how you could use EFT to help do that?
Sure. And when I say grieving properly, in a way, I probably mean grieving thoroughly, because on one hand, grief isn't a process that we just pick off the shelf and then adopt. There are stages of grief. And even though those stages are really helpful, and you and your viewers may have heard that denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, depression, it's not like a neat linear progression from one stage to the next. Like, I've ticked off stage one and I'll move into stage two. If you think of grief as a spiral, where you can revisit those stages, you can go from stage one to stage three, back to stage two, then maybe four, and it moves around. If you allow yourself to say, actually, grief is a healing process, and I need to grieve in order to heal, and actually embrace grief rather than trying to deny it. That's what I mean by grieving properly. And actually, there is no way to grieve properly, because everyone's grief will be individual. But allowing ourselves to grieve is so important. And I mean, at the moment, with COVID being, changing the way that we think about life and death and what life means, we're able to talk about grief more, which, even though it's a very emotive subject, it's very important to be able to talk about how necessary grief is. So, I mean, if you take anything from today, is to allow yourself that time to grieve, give yourself permission to grieve, and use grief as the healing process that it is.
I do want to ask you one last thing. EFT and tapping, could you just give us a quick guide, explanation as to what that is and what it involves?
Of course, thank you. Yes, so it's called tapping because we're literally tapping on the acupressure points of the body, and there's specific points, but it's also very easy and forgiving. So we're working on the body's energy lines and meridians, chi. So if you've heard of traditional Chinese medicine, it's working on those energy points, and it's all about how we store that energy. And so you might know that feeling of, that reaction, that gut reaction, or when you feel sick to your stomach, or you're finding it really, you're all choked up and you can't speak. Those phrases that we have in everyday language are relating to how our energy feels in our body, how we're manifesting our emotions. And so EFT works on identifying how you feel, and it's literally, what is that emotion you're feeling? Is it anger churning in your stomach? But concentrating on the physicality of it, and then we start tapping. There's the sequence, and we literally start identifying. So we might say, all that emotion churning in my stomach. I feel this, wave of anger and envy just flowing through my body. And we talk through different phrases that resonate with the client. And you can see that I'm doing a round of tapping at the moment. Don't worry, you don't need to know what the acupressure points are. But we literally start breaking the connection between the subconscious, which creates our reactions, and the physicality. So if you imagine that, as young children, young girls, we probably played with dolls. And so when we were little, we were given dolls to play with, because one day we're going to be a mum, so we have to learn how to hold a baby and feed it a bottle. And so we've grown up from a very early age knowing that we have a role to play. When we are childless, we're not playing that role. So our belief is that, well, actually, I'm not doing what I was meant to do, become a mum. And so that belief, which is ingrained in us, comes out in that manifestation of stomach churning, ears, eyes welling up with tears, all those physical reactions we have, especially to pregnancy announcements. You know what? There's all those triggers. EFT breaks the cycle of reaction because we're looking at the subconscious and we're looking at our beliefs. And that allows us to think, well, actually, I haven't had a baby. I haven't become a mum. I'm still a woman. I'm still a person. I'm still here. I still have my life. I am still worthy. So EFT works on breaking the connection and creating space for the positivity to come back into our lives.
Let the audience know how they can connect with you.
Oh, thanks, Brandi. Yeah, so my website is worthyandcontent.com, and I chose that name very specifically because I am worthy and I am content with my life, and I want other people to feel worthy and content as well. So it's worthyandcontent.com. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and I do Zoom therapy all over the world now. I mean, prior to COVID, it was face-to-face. And I'm looking forward to coming out of lockdown in the UK and working face-to-face. But I love Zoom as well. So I'll be continuing this work to be able to help people everywhere, as long as you've got access to a computer and a relevant time zone. So I'd love to be able to help people because we don't have to stay sad. We don't have to have that burden of childlessness that we have had. And we don't need to, we need to know actually that it doesn't need to stay like that. And feeling good about life is possible.
I feel better. I can only imagine that those listening are feeling that your website name, Worthy and Content, those are just two wonderful words. You made a good choice there on that name.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, because it is about sharing the possibilities. And of course, it's not always easy for everyone, and everyone has got their own story, their own background. It'll be the right time at different times for everyone. But for other people, especially those who are younger than myself or who, have just come to the realization that having children isn't going to work for them, it is possible to feel better. So as long as people can take some comfort from that, then I'll be very happy.
Thank you again so much, Lana, for joining us today. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to see more Tutum Talks, please make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel.